Anybody? Usually, well, it's good for mom and dad, I guess, but the kids, it kind of messes them up. Of course, I've been divorced twice, so. And I've got one child that claims that it's not good for her. Interesting. It was an interesting situation. There's reason why my first wife didn't come around very much after I was remarried. And the reason was because she liked one kid more than the other, and she showed a lot. And because of that, it really upset my new wife. She thought that wasn't fair at all. She thought both kids were pretty good kids. And she really found that irritating. So she told her, either treat both kids the same or don't come around. So she decided not to come around. As horrible as that sounds. Most states permit two kinds of custodial arrangements, sole and joint custody, each with two aspects, physical and legal. Physical custody refers to the living arrangements, whereas legal custody concerns the responsibility for decision making. As I told you before, my daughter is in one of these types of relationships. Gets kind of squirrely, especially around Christmas and Thanksgiving. Last year, my grandson went to Florida for Thanksgiving. This year, he gets to stay in Iowa, and the other custodial parent, or the other parent, is really complaining about it because he's kind of a holiday dad, and he really he has all these plans. He does things like, oh, it's Florida, so he goes to. They went to Key West for snorkeling over the summer. He's got some kind of strange plans for Christmas. I'm not exactly sure what they are, but it's kind of messing the kid up, and it's not good. The kid comes back angry at Iowa. If he had to go to school in Florida, I'm sure it would upset him that he was in a really bad school, because they don't have good schools in Florida. But he considers Florida a place to play, because that's all he does when he's in Florida, is he plays. Anyway, so we have legal custody and physical custody. In sole custody, the child will live with one parent, although the other may be granted visitation rights, and the same parent will have legal decision-making authority, and that is usually the way it works. A lot of times, once there's a split, once there's a split, one of the parents will just kind of wander away, and you don't see him very much anymore. In the beginning, of course, they're demanding this and they're demanding that, and usually they'll stick around for a couple of years, but after that, especially if they start a new relationship, a lot of times, as long as that relationship, as long as the custodial relationship isn't part of their new marriage, a lot of times they'll just drift away, especially if they start their own family. It gets kind of interesting after that. In joint custody, both parents retain parental rights in concerning decisions about the child. This is joint legal custody, and the child can alternate living in the parents' homes, and this is known as joint physical custody, and that's the situation we have with my daughter. Kind of an odd situation, because there's it's about 2,000 miles from Florida to Iowa. So he complains a lot about having to fly up. Of course, he's only flown up once. He's flying up next weekend, which ought to be interesting. So we'll see what happens. I keep saying that ugly things tend to happen. He's kind of a grouchy guy. He thinks that he should be in charge. Wants to be in charge of everything. But of course now he can't be, because his grandson is, his son is 2,000 miles away, so he really can't be in charge. So every time something happens, he calls up on the phone and yells and tells my daughter what he thinks should happen, and my daughter tells him, well, you don't know the situation. Then they get into an interesting conversation. The other day he was inebriated, and he called on the phone. and started screaming at her, which was kind of a strange situation. Started tweeting her, and when she hung up the phone on him, so he started, I don't know what they call it, but it's blast tweeting, where they you know, her phone was just tied up for the next 2 or 3 hours with him sending her all these horrible tweets. And he was afraid that
I hope she's saving those,
I don't
just in case.
You know, if I were her, I would be a lot more angry with this individual than she is. She's not. She's trying to maintain a civil relationship. It's almost like she hopes that someday he'll come back to her. You know, one of those kind of deals. It ain't gonna happen. He hates women. He wants to be in charge of everything. He comes from a wealthy family. Wealthy people think that they know everything. That money gives them intelligence. That's one of the problems we have with our current president.
Supposedly he has money.
Where did he get his money, and why does that make him so bright about everything? That's a question that we ask. But of course this guy has the same idea. So he thinks he knows everything. It's really irritating, since he has no knowledge base whatsoever. Okay, usually one parent is designated as the residential parent. That's the parent that where the child resides primarily. Differences between sole and joint custody. Joint custody distributes the frequency of interaction more evenly between the children and each parent. Joint custody requires more interactions between the divorced parents and generates more demands for cooperation concerning the children. And of course, cooperation is the operant word here. You know, the problem is, of course, sometimes because there is conflict between mom and dad, there is very little cooperation. They don't like to interact or communicate at all. And that's kind of what's going on with my daughter right now. He needs to find another girlfriend, so he'll leave my daughter alone. And it's not like he's being nice to her at all. He wants to attack her all the time, which is not a very pleasant situation. Joint custody results in more alterations in caregiving arrangements, along with more separations and reunions between children and parents. And of course, that is always heartrending. Children in joint custody fared better than children in sole custody on a number of measures related to adjustment and interpersonal relations. Fathers benefited from joint custody because they had more frequent contact with their children. Mothers benefited because it afforded them greater opportunity for courtship. And it's always good when dad's around too. Fathers represent, I don't know, I'm not exactly sure what they represent, but they represent something. And it's obvious that the more parents around, the more discipline there is available, and the more the child sees that they are loved and taken and should be taken care of, or could be taken care of, which is always nice. Anyway, that's kind of the way it works. Evidence on the effects of divorce on children, it's not good. The most significant effects of divorce on children occur in the first year or two after the breakup. Both the well-being of the primary parent and the level of parental conflict are major factors influencing outcomes. Children from families in which the parents have a great deal of conflict seem to do better following divorce than do children from low-conflict families. Usually they just can't see what's going on. The children don't ever know. And of course, you try not to give them that information. Yes, ma'am.
Well, not in some cases where, like, let's say, in a scenario, like, a couple was married and then the dad just splits and hasn't been heard of, like, say, 6 years, and decides he finally wants divorce.
Oh, great.
And then mom and child have moved on, and both are happy. The child's well-being is able to.
And now he wants to come back.
And he wants to come back, and he wants to see the child after no contact, no.
After no contact for 6 years. How old was the child when according to the scenario, how
The
old was the
scenario
child
would-
when
He
the
or
asshole
she
left?
would probably be like 3.
3, okay. It has a lot to do with memory. The younger the child is when the divorce happens, the better off for the kid, because they don't remember anything. They don't remember the conflict, they don't remember anything. 3 years old, they were just starting to get their of course you can speak, but that's not really what you remember. Children start remembering about a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, right in there, but they don't have a really strong memory. Remember, there's a lot of fantasy going on in the kid's brain. They think that the teddy bear's alive, that kind of stuff.
Isn't it until after 3 years old that they start functioning or using,
Yeah, that's
kind of
right there at the 3 year mark.
establishing memory in your brain?
Exactly, and that's the turning point. As long as there's very little memory, then you got no problem. The kid's not even going to remember potentially what the individual looked like. I was watching a movie this weekend. It had Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn in it. Anyway, she left when her baby was a baby, and she expected the baby to remember her of course, and the baby didn't. But the older daughter did. Anyway, everything turned out bad in that situation. But of course, the kid never remembered. The one kid that she left. So it all depends. It really all depends. My situation, what was my situation? My wife first left when my son was 9 months old. She kept coming back whenever she got in trouble. She wanted me to bail her out. Literally sometimes. Luckily, I was in Texas and she was in Indiana, so it wasn't too bad. She just kind of wandered back every once in a while whenever she got in trouble in Indiana. Not a very good situation, because then she moved down to Texas, which was not good. And being the idiot that I am, well, no, I wanted the kids to see their mom. I mean, that didn't make a whole lot of sense. And at the time, I was certainly not connected to anybody else. Him coming back after 6 years, everybody's happy. It's almost like he doesn't exist anymore, and then all of a sudden he does exist, yeah. What's best for the child? The child is probably, especially here on the reservation, where you guys have such extensive extended families. The child probably doesn't miss the male parent very much, because there's other male parents around, grandparents and whatnot. Lots of grandparents,
Uncles,
lots of
nephews.
uncles,
About
exactly.
4 years, yeah.
And everybody likes to play with the kids, or maybe not, I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I would say that it's not necessary for that person to come back. If they do want to come back, I don't know what we could call them, the absent parent. I don't know. This is your father who took off when you were 3 years old. You probably don't remember him, but, I don't know.
I mean, wouldn't that just, I
Yeah.
don't know.
And the child probably has already identified somebody else as a parental figure anyway. That's just usually the way it works. Kids are really good at it. Teachers sometimes, grandpa, Uncle Charlie, whatever. There's always somebody around who loves kids. Anyway, so especially if there was a high conflict situation where potentially one individual was either psychologically or physically abusing the other, it's a good thing to separate those two individuals. Around 75% of children whose parents divorce will not experience significant developmental challenges or long-term negative effects of the divorce. 75%. The bad news is that 25% will. 1 out of every 4 children will. And sometimes it will be in the same family, that one person didn't care that the parent left and the other one did. A lot of times, and you would think it would be the child that got the most out of the relationship, but it's not. It's the abused child. The abused child will focus on the abusing parent, and they are the ones that will suffer, as weird as that sounds. So the one that was treated the best will forget about the parent, no problems, everything's fine. The one that was treated poorly by the absent parent is the one that will suffer the most. As weird as that sounds. We see this all the time. This is something that you might remember for the future. If you ever get into a situation where you're looking at a family situation, if there is an abusing situation, whether it's physical, psychological, or sexual, a lot of times that child, that will be their favorite parent, the one that is abusing them. So that's something to remember. A lot of times they won't talk about the other parent. They won't even interact with, they don't refer to the other parent, despite the fact that one parent's good and the other parent's bad. The good parent will be ignored, as weird as that sounds. So that's something to think about if you're ever looking at a situation and you've got one parent that the child talks about all the time. That's probably the parent that is doing the abusing. The parent that is the safe parent, the child doesn't think about, because it's kind of like hiding in your closet or something. You don't ever talk about how wonderful your closet is. What you talk about is the fact that going outside is dangerous. That's what you talk about. You talk about the danger, you don't talk about the safety. As weird as that may seem. What makes it less likely that divorce will adversely affect the children involved? The custodial parent is competent and well-adjusted, and that's important as long as... And now here's the sad part. Well, I just told you what the sad part is. The custodial parent is the one that the child won't pay any attention to, as weird as that sounds. Parent has regular and consistent contact and takes an active interest in the activities and school performance of the child. This is particularly important. In other words, they show the child that they are important by going to as many things as they possibly can, telling them that their good grades are important. That's the most important thing to the child. Because the child feels abandoned. And if they've got a parent that cares about their extracurricular activities and their school activities, it shows them that they are important. Otherwise, they feel abandoned. There are families where I was a high school coach for a really, really long time. Well, not that long. Anyway, I coached kids a lot. And the kids whose parents came around, they were the kids that were the best adjusted. But I had some parents that never, ever saw their kid play this or that or the other. I always had to pick them up or take them home from practice. I had to take them to the games. Parents were never there. And those kids were the ones that felt abandoned. So this is really, really important as far as the kids are concerned. A lot of times they dropped out of sports because they weren't important. They weren't important to the parent, therefore they weren't important to the child, no matter how good they were. The parents are cooperative, or at least they keep the child from exposure to interparental conflict. This is especially important. A lot of times the kid feels like they are part of the conflict, and that's not good, because usually it doesn't have anything to do with the kid. It usually has to do with mom and dad and whatever it is that they're arguing about. whatever horrors the two of them have gone through. And of course, there was a time before the child, and a lot of times that is part of the conflict. The custodial parent has extended family support, and of course that is really important. This is one of the reasons that my daughter moved from Florida to Iowa. She had she couldn't get any support from his family, and she had no family down there. So she had to move, or so she moved. Wait a minute. She moved. What am I doing? Yeah. So she moved up to Iowa. And now, yesterday, my daughter, I called, they had to go to school yesterday. You know, it was terrible. I called my daughter on the phone and she was in class. Anyway. And my grandson was being picked up by my wife so that she could take him to soccer practice. So, you know, down there, everybody would have been out of luck because his family won't have anything to do with my grandson. Anyway, it's a lot better situation for everybody involved. Assessment and custody disputes. There are 3 approaches to appointing evaluators. A judge can appoint 1 clinician to conduct a custody evaluation that is available to all parties. This is very common. Each side can retain its own expert to conduct independent evaluations. This doesn't happen very often because if that happens, then one psychologist is going to say the mother is the best, and the other is going to say the father is the best, and there's something wrong with the other one. This resolves nothing. The sides can agree to share the expenses of hiring an expert to conduct 1 evaluation. They need 1 evaluation. They need 1 person looking at both parents. And this is usually what the judges will select. They'll select either 1 or 3. For both of them to get an evaluation doesn't make any sense because the psychologist will agree with whoever pays them the most money.
So what percent do the fathers get custody?
About 20%.
20%.
About 80% of the time the mother gets the custody. Most custody evaluations include following components: clinical history, social history, and mental status interviews of the parents and the children. In other words, they want to find out if the kids are stable or not. They need to find out if the mother and the father are stable. This has a lot to do with drugs. It also has a lot to do with alcohol. Drugs and alcohol, all bets are off with drugs and alcohol.
Is that like a mental assessment?
No, this is that's a social.
Financial.
That's a history. That's a social and clinical history. Where they're trying to determine if either parent has a drug or alcohol problem. This is alcohol, so it can be a social problem. It could be a clinical problem in that they have a mental. It causes them to act differently when they're drunk. Most people do act differently when they're drunk. Most people, if they're happy when they're sober, then they're grouchy when they're drunk, or vice versa. If they're grouchy when they're sober, they're happy when they're drunk. So this can be a really serious problem. If you know anything about alcoholic families, a lot of times the child will never know what their personality is going to be when they come home. If the parent is drunk, because sometimes they're violent, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're happy. Standardized testing of parents and children, of course, they will test them. Potentially they'll give them an Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, MMPI. Observation of interactions between each parent and children, especially minors. Who does the child go to, especially if it's a little guy? Whose lap do they want to sit on? Yes, ma'am.
What if there was like a history of domestic violence within the marriage? before, but the mother never like made any reports or anything like that.
No, isn't that terrible? That's
Yeah.
why you were saying that my daughter should have saved the tweets, the texts that he's nothing to me. What am I talking about? Yeah, this could be a problem. Of course, they're trying to save the marriage, and so they're not saying anything to anybody about the domestic violence situation. And then all of a sudden, you know, you've never called the cops, and you've never told anybody, and you've never gone to the doctor every time you have a black eye.
Like in the, let's say the
Not a
divorce
whole lot
papers
you-
or whatever, it says
We
like.
have no proof that it
Yeah.
ever took place, and that's the biggest problem. But a lot of times, they can tell that in an interview, they can tell if the individual was abusive or not, just by his demeanor, by the individual's demeanor, or by the way
What
that
if
he
that person
talks.
is just really good at being so.
I know, isn't that terrible? People with antisocial personality disorder are liars, and they're good at it. Alcoholics are good at it too. They're so good. They're like the best liars in the world. I know. But if they can determine if the individual has antisocial personality disorder, then that's a big red X right off the bat. So,
How would they be able to determine that?
what, that he has antisocial personality disorder? They would put him in a situation where he might react negatively by accusing him of something, something silly, and then he gets angry. So then they'll know he's got antisocial personality disorder. It's not an easy one to determine, especially if he's a charmer. Yeah. See, that's my, well, I can't even call him my son-in-law. He's not my son-in-law at all. But he was a bit of a charmer. Or at least he thought he was. He's the one who started flirting with the judge, female judge, of course, and the lawyers, because he thought he could wrap them around his finger. But
And the judge didn't fall for it?
no, my goodness, no. No, she knew what was going on. This had happened before. I mean, he doesn't like women. He hates mothers. Both of the women that he made babies with, he just attacks them all the time.
So
He
what
hates
makes-
his own mother.
So what makes a person like that go from one relationship into the other?
Oh, he's charming. He's wealthy. He's attracted to women, and women give him the positive feelings that he needs. As we grow up, as we are in high school, grade school, and then high school, this is how we gauge how important we are, by how much attention we get from the opposite sex. This is important to everybody. You see the same negative situation with women. How much attention do they get from men? This is very important to people. It's not just important to high school cheerleaders, it's also important to everybody. How much do men flirt with women? How much do women flirt with men? How much attention do they pay to each other? That's social. Has to do with social history. Anyway, important stuff. Assessments or interviews with people who have observed the family. Of course, this gets kind of interesting. Documents and records that might be relevant to the case, and there you go. That's what they look at. A lot of times they get a different picture. The one person you can't talk to is grandma and grandpa, because grandma and grandpa are prejudiced toward their own child. Their own child makes no mistakes, that kind of thing. Friends of the family, they're good to talk to. You're looking for documents and records. Of course, this is a situation where if somebody called the cops, then now it's documented. But of course, if they didn't call the police, who in the world are we going to talk to? Frequency of different kinds of custodial arrangements. Joint legal custody, about 42.8% of the time. A little more than 40%. Sole custody with visitation, 30.4% of the time. Joint physical custody, 21.7% of the time. Sole custody without visitation happens very, very rarely. But of course, a lot of times, if somebody has sole custody, then the other parent just disappears for 6 years or longer, depending. It really all depends. What happened with my situation? I married my current wife. We got orders to Germany almost right away. So we were gone for 3 years. And it's not like she could come and visit. She could have if she wanted to, of course, but she didn't want to. It's too expensive. At that time, it was, and it was difficult to call. You couldn't call. We had no telephone. This was before cell phones. This is back in the 70s and 80s. And Germany only had a select number of telephones. It was really kind of weird. So there was no way to call. So writing letters was the only way we could communicate. And so she started sending presents, and she would send, she always sent presents on my daughter's birthday. She sent presents for Christmas. But she always sent more presents to my daughter than my son, which I thought was not really right. But there was nothing I could do. So my wife wrote her a letter and said, if you can't treat both kids the same, then just don't interact with them, because it's killing Chris. So she decided she wouldn't send any presents at all. So she cut all ties after that. She tried to make contact after we came back. Where did we go? We went to Nebraska. And at that time, she was married to a railroad worker down in Carlsbad, New Mexico. So she made contact a couple times. But it didn't last. She came back for each child's graduation. So the last time anybody has ever seen her was my son's graduation in 1990. It's the last time anybody's seen her. I guess she's Facebook friends with somebody. I think it's my daughter. She's Facebook friends with my daughter. Assessment and custody disputes. Many judges require divorcing couples to attempt to settle issues of custody, visitation, and support through mediation. In mediation, if mediation fails, the couple can return to court and have the judge decide the issues, and of course that's what happened in my daughter's case. In my case, of course, my ex-wife left. She took off. She was gone. She was in another state when I tried to divorce her. And I told you that first time I got a divorce, the judge tried to take the kids away from me, even though she was in another state. Now, he couldn't give her custody of the children because she was gone. She was in Illinois. She was actually, well, it's not important. She was in Carthage, Illinois. Carthage, Illinois is where, if you know anything about Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, that's where he was murdered. He was murdered in jail. Anyway, that's where she was. Right across the river from Keokuk, Iowa. The benefits of custody mediation are that resolution are reached more quickly and with better compliance. The judge was a Baptist minister, and he tried to take the kids away because he said a man cannot raise a female child. That's what he said. A man can't raise a female child. But he couldn't take them away because they weren't residents of the state of Texas. They were residents of the state of Indiana. The state must protect children from parents who do not provide adequate food, shelter, and supervision, or who abuse them physically or psychologically. A lot of times if an individual uses, and this is one of the reasons why we have to determine if somebody's using drugs, especially if they were using crystal meth. Crystal meth, when people use crystal meth, it's the most important thing in the whole wide world. More important than everything. More important than kids, more important than sex, more important than everything. So getting that next fix is the most important thing to you. So that's one of the things that we have to determine. I had when I was up north in Montana, there was a situation where there was a lady with a 1.5-year-old and a 3-year-old. 1.5-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son, and she was a meth head. And what they did up north, they'd have house parties where they would, on a select weekend, they'd get, a big pile of meth, and they'd invite all their buddies and friends in, and they would sell chunks of it to people, and that's how they made money. This is, they're entrepreneurs there. But during that weekend, all bets were off. All kinds of horrible things were happening at this house. This lady had a house party, and afterwards she discovered that both of her children had been molested. I know, but she didn't start caring until like 3 days later. The grandparents came in, and they're the ones that discovered that both of them had been molested. The 3-year-old boy and the year and a half, the girl that was 18 months old. And so they took the kids out of the home, and then 3 days later she came to get them. And of course they were talking about what did they eat. There's nothing to eat. When people use crystal meth, they're not hungry. There's no food in the house. They were drinking beer out of glasses that somebody left a little bit of beer. That's all they had to eat. The 2 kids. So they took the kids away from them, and the grandparents got the custody of the children. So about a week later, what do? The courts take the kids away from the mother, and about a week later, guess what happened? Grandparents, because their little girl wouldn't hurt their babies as long as she's not tweaking. They gave them back, and so it wasn't. So the next weekend, there was a house party someplace else, and she left the kids in the house, all by themselves, without any food. It's one of those kind of deals. But you couldn't convince the parents that she was not taking care of her children. They couldn't believe that she would take care of her children. Anyway, eventually they gave the kids to her sister, and she took them to another reservation. I would like to say everything turned out okay, but it didn't. Because she gave the kids back. And then, of course, the same thing happened again. It was just an ugly, ugly story that had only negative results, because nobody would believe that this woman wouldn't take care of her children. She was a good mother as long as she wasn't tweaking, but the problem was she was tweaking a lot and almost all the time. Always looking for a house party. Anyway. Clinician might recommend temporary foster care, and that the parents receive training in parental skills, or in extreme cases, might seek to terminate parental rights. The last I heard, the kids were like 5 and 3. They were 5 and 3, and she was going through training, but she kept dropping out of training and then going back, dropping out and going back. So that's the last I heard before I left. I was so worried about those 2 kids, and I'd never met them before. But I was the instructor for the sister, and I told her when she gave the kids back to the mother that she was going to lose her rights, and she wasn't going to be able to get the kids back. And she said, "Yeah, but I love my sister." And I was thinking, fine. You can love your sister. Do you want to sacrifice your nephew and your niece for your sister? That's what I was thinking. But then again, I didn't love her sister, so I don't know. In all 50 states and the District of Columbia, they have civil commitment laws that authorize the custody and restraint of persons who, as a result of mental illness, are a danger to themselves or others, or who are so gravely disabled that they cannot care for themselves. This is a really serious problem. It's really difficult to incarcerate, or not to incarcerate, to put somebody in a secure situation if they don't want to be in that secure situation. It's not the easiest thing in the world. So all we have to do is we have to take them to court, and we have to determine if they can take care of themselves, or if they're a danger to somebody else. Beginning around 1970, commitment proceedings began to be reformed, resulting in more legal rights for the mentally ill to resist compulsory commitment. Before that, it was very difficult. No, it wasn't difficult at all to get somebody committed. There's several different ways you can do that. You can commit somebody. In the 1970s, all you had to do was go to a judge, and the judge would sign off on committing somebody. If a legal person, a lawyer, had a political enemy, they could have him committed if they could prove, and they really didn't have to prove anything. All they had to do was sign a writ, and they would send him to a mental hospital. There was an actress once upon a time by the name of Frances Farmer. And Frances Farmer was a communist. In the 1950s, of course, they had the Red Scare going on and the McCarthy hearings. At that time, she was preaching socialism. Socialism is something you're going to hear a lot about in the next election. Because there are the conservatives in the United States are going to use that as the bat to beat the more liberal people in the United States. They're going to claim that they're socialists. It should be interesting because only the older people in the United States have a clue what socialism is. The young kids have no clue. So it should be interesting to watch this. But anyway, Frances Farmer was a socialist, and she would rail against democracy, the fact that the wealthy had the wealthy had everything, and they had all the power and whatnot. And they would get mad at her, and they would put her in a mental hospital. Eventually, they gave her a frontal lobotomy. She was this gorgeous actress from Minnesota. And eventually they changed her brain by severing her frontal cortex from the rest of the brain, as bizarre as that sounds. I know. Yes, they gave her a frontal lobotomy. But this is before they started reforming all of these things. They claimed that she had no rights to anything. There was another individual that had problems. A lady by the name of Veronica Lake. She was blonde, and she had her hair over one eye, if you've ever watched those movies. Veronica Lake was a femme fatale. She was a very attractive lady. She was schizophrenic, and they diagnosed her with schizophrenia before she became a great actress, and she was very difficult to work with, evidently. But eventually, of course, whenever she gave somebody a hard time on the set, they would commit her for a couple days. They would just sign her into the hospital for a couple days. Eventually, she died of alcoholism. She kind of drifted away from acting, and so eventually she died in her 50s of alcoholism, as weird as that is. So they really did need to reform all of this stuff in the 1970s. 1975, the Supreme Court held that mental illness and a need for treatment were insufficient justifications for involuntarily committing mentally ill persons who were not dangerous. So if they were just a danger to themselves, or even not a danger to themselves, you couldn't just commit somebody because they were schizophrenic or whatever. You couldn't just put them in an asylum. I was watching a movie the other day. It was Lost Weekend with Ray Milland. Ray Milland was an alcoholic. and he went on a bender on one weekend, and he ended up in the drunk tank. But it wasn't a drunk tank, it was the mental hospital, where they put all the drunks. And they arrested him because he fell down the stairs and he hurt himself, and they realized that he was drunk. So they put him in lockup. And this is back in the 1950s. So we changed all the laws. Similar limits on involuntary hospitalizations have been upheld by the Supreme Court in the 1990s. Fauci versus Louisiana, 1992. If you didn't like somebody, or if they wanted to arrest an individual that was a drinker or a drug user who was also a criminal, they just put him in a mental hospital. They would arrest him, they would say that you're going through the DTs, and then they would put him in a mental hospital. So it was a good way to get criminals off the street, was to just throw them in a mental hospital. But then they realized, wait a minute, this isn't right. We're using mental illness as an excuse to incarcerate our criminals. We can't really do this anymore. So in the 1990s, they changed everything. Now you got to remember that I was born in 1949, and I grew up in the 1960s, and I was in the military in the 1970s, and this is when they started changing all this stuff. In the 1960s, one of the things that they used to do, especially with the individuals that were the civil rights workers, the anti-war protesters, a lot of times they'd arrest them and they would either put them in jail for one thing or another, or they'd put them in a mental hospital. So this is a means of social control. They were using it as a means of social control to stop people from doing what they didn't want them to do. Protesting. The March on Washington. March on Washington was a constant. And it's one of the reasons why Richard Nixon was so upset with what was going on. It's not like there weren't a lot of protesters out there. There were a ton of protesters out there. And a lot of them were protesting the war in Vietnam, but they were also protesting the fact that Richard Nixon was a bit autocratic. He was an individual that nobody was trying to control. And that was in the 1970s. So they arrested a lot of these people and they put them in mental hospitals. Now all of a sudden, if you're a protester, not only do you have a record, a criminal record, but you also have a mental health record, which is completely fabricated. The standard for commitment changed from mental illness and in the need of treatment to mental illness that was associated with dangerousness or a grave lack of ability to care for yourself. So back in the old days, if you said something like, down with the establishment, they could put you in a mental hospital and they would shoot you up with Thorazine, or they would try to change the way that you said things. But eventually they had to change this. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't just treat people because you think they're mentally ill, and the reason you think they're mentally ill is because they don't agree with you. You can't do that anymore. They have to be dangerous, or they have to be a danger to themselves or danger to other people. The laws permitted 4 types of civil commitment. The first is emergency detention. This is the most common way that individuals are initially admitted to the hospitals. This would be an individual that's unconscious, that needs treatment of one kind or another. They put them in a mental hospital, or they were schizophrenic and they weren't making any sense. Voluntary inpatient commitment. A lot of individuals will admit themselves to the mental hospital. There was an actor once upon a time by the name of Robert Walker. He died in the 1950s. He was in a movie called Strangers on the Train, which is it's a Hitchcock film. That's from 1954. Anyway, he was in that movie. He did a fabulous job. 2 months before it was released, he committed suicide. But the whole point with Robert Walker was that he kept involuntarily committing himself as an inpatient at a mental hospital. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He'd been married to a very attractive woman. They had 2 children, and that woman wanted to become an actress, so she started having an affair with one of the moguls from the movie studio, and that just destroyed him. Of course, he was schizophrenic already, and it just kicked him into a crisis. And he was a good actor. You should see, if you ever have a chance to see Strangers on a Train with Farley Granger and Robert Walker, it is a fabulous movie. It's really good. Well, it's a Hitchcock movie. You know, all Hitchcock movies are good. Anyway, Robert Walker committed suicide before the movie came out. And of course, they were afraid to give him the Academy Award. He acted like a crazy man in the movie, and he was actually crazy in real life. So, yeah, I know. So he did a really good job. But they were afraid to give him the Academy Award because he committed suicide, and they didn't want that publicized. Anyway, so he voluntarily committed himself to a mental hospital on several occasions because he was so upset with his first wife. Involuntary inpatient commitment requires a court order. A lot of times individuals will try to get somebody, because they are a danger to the society, they'll try to get them committed. And the last is outpatient commitment, so that they're not really committed to the hospital. They're not really in the hospital. They are being treated as an outpatient. The terms dangerous and dangerousness merge 3 distinct constructs. Risk factors, variables associated with the probability that violence or aggression will occur. A lot of times individuals, if there is a proper trigger, then they will become dangerous to other individuals. We're talking about serial killers or mass murderers. Evidently they have a female that's a serial killer they've just arrested. It's a female. This is a real oddity. Women usually don't become serial killers, but in this case, she is. So as long as the trigger isn't there, then we're okay. The case of the individual in Texas that shot up the church, he had violent tendencies. They kicked him out of the military, got a dishonorable discharge because of his violent tendencies. But the military didn't tell anybody, and now everybody's pissed off at the Air Force for not telling everybody that this man had a mental illness. But the reality was, of course, his family knew that he had violent tendencies. And what happened on that given day was that he was angry with his mother-in-law. His mother-in-law had confronted him, and she told him that she knew that he had a problem. And because of that, he needed to hide it. And his way of hiding it was going into the church and shooting everybody. His wife and his child, I guess he had 2 children, were not there. And his mother-in-law wasn't there. But he went into the church to kill his mother-in-law. And started shooting people, looking for his mother-in-law. And of course, she wasn't there. So there was a trigger. There were risk factors. And she's the one that triggered the violence. Harm, the nature and the severity of predicted and actual aggression, and risk level, the probability that harm will occur. I told you that once upon a time I was a consultant, and we were looking at sexual offenders in Ohio, trying to determine how much of a risk factor they were, whether we could release these individuals. That was our job. And we went through reams and reams, hundreds of individuals who had been sex offenders, they were rapists, they were pedophiles, and we had to determine if they could be released from prison. They were incarcerating these people, and they were holding them in prison as long as they possibly could. And then, of course, they had to release them. When they got to the end of their sentence, they had to release them. Sometimes they wanted to parole them, and that was our job as well. We had to look at these cases, and we had to determine the risk factors, the harm, the risk level that they represented. It was a hard, tough job. Because the reality is, as long as as you don't confront the trigger, then you're okay. But as soon as there is a trigger, then all of a sudden the risk factors change. Everything changes. So how in the world do you keep them away from their triggers? How do you know what's going to happen next? How can you predict that they can stay away from their triggers, or that the environment won't trigger their violent behavior? How can you do that? Do you have a right to put this person in jail forever? No, not unless they have a life sentence. That was a tough one. I wanted to leave these people in jail until the end of their sentence. But the state wanted to parole them because it was costing too much money to house them. So a lot of times we talked about risk factors, we talked about triggers, and as long as the trigger wasn't obvious, then they let them go. They let them out of prison. We more likely than not said that they should stay in prison, and the parole board released them anyway. That's what happened. It was a really frustrating job. Clinicians who perform risk assessments try to predict which persons are and are not likely to behave violently in certain circumstances, and the problem is we're talking about certain circumstances. You put this person in a select circumstance, and the probability is that it will trigger them for violence. This is the way it works with PTSD. I have a brother that came back from Vietnam angry, came back wanting to hit people, wanting to punch people, wanting to fight. He's not a drinker, but he would go to bars. And whenever somebody gave him a hard time, he would beat him up. And then he was, of course, sometimes this person had a friend, then he would have to beat that person up. The odd thing was he's not a very large person. He's actually a little bit smaller than I am. But he would go into bars and clean the place out. And the reason he would do that is because when he fought to win, he never fought fairly. If he could hit somebody in a place that would dispatch them, then that's exactly what he would do. And of course he had been trained to kill people, so he knew where to hit people. And he did. And he would drop the biggest guy you can possibly imagine. Not that I'm not bragging, because the reality was he was angry. And as long as we kept him out of bars, he didn't get in trouble. But he used to go visit his friends from Vietnam. He had a friend in Kent, Ohio. That's where Kent State is. And every time he went over there, he got thrown in jail. And they would throw him in jail he'd go to the nastiest dives you can possibly imagine and beat people up. So the cops didn't really care, because he was beating up people that they wanted to beat up themselves. Anyway, and they'd throw him in jail. They'd throw him in jail for a week or 2 weeks or whatever. So, big serious problem. Give some estimate of risk for violence. Offer suggestions on how to reduce the risks. Well, of course, the best way to reduce the risk is to change the environment. If you can change their environment, you're okay. As soon as he stopped going into bars, the guy committed suicide. The person that he was going over to visit committed suicide. After that, he never went to Kent, Ohio again. He never took a bottle of tequila with him, and he never went into a bar and cleaned the place up. The base rate of violence in some groups is low, so clinicians are being asked to predict a phenomenon that rarely occurs. If we're talking about PTSD, well, if we're talking about PTSD, it's a different story. If we're talking about sexual assault, if we're talking about alcoholism, if you can change the individual's environment, a lot of times you can change their behavior. Clinical assessments of persons are often conducted in hospitals or prisons, whereas one needs to know risk of violence in a community, and of course that's the reality. What's going to happen when they go when they go to Kent, Ohio. What's going to happen is that the two of them are going to go out drinking, even though my brother didn't drink. And he would always take the guy a bottle of tequila. My parents convinced him not to go visit this guy. So he stayed away for like 6 months, and at the end of that 6 months, he committed suicide. My brother thought that he was keeping this person alive, but every time he went over there, he'd get in trouble. Okay. So, I don't know, is that a good thing or a bad thing? He stopped visiting this guy, and this guy committed suicide. So what was more important, my brother getting in trouble or this man's life? How do you look at that?
I think it's hard to,
You shouldn't take responsibility for someone else's
Yeah.
action. I think that's what should be.
That's good rationalization.
That's
That's good rationalization.
You know,
I don't disagree.
was he trying to get help himself? 'Cause-
No, my God,
And
no.
I think that's just
You ever
it.
been around people with PTSD?
now, if we go to.
Never.
Yeah, so how often do they go and get help?
They don't.
They don't, exactly,
And
that's
it's
the whole point.
tough.
That's,
So,
yeah, because, yeah, this is part of their persona, is the fact that they don't need help. I'm sorry.
If your brother had gone over there and the guy still committed suicide, your brother would have felt even more guilty.
And he felt pretty bad because he didn't go over it. He was going over about every 2 or 3 months. He was going over with a bottle of tequila. And he had a bottle of tequila in his car. Now here's the bizarre part. He owned a brand new Ford Mustang. It was all tricked out. And he had that bottle of tequila. That bottle of tequila is still in the trunk of that car. And that car hasn't moved since the guy committed suicide. Right. Sitting in my parents', well, my parents are gone. It's my brother's house now. Anyway, it's sitting there and it hasn't moved in, wait a minute, he came back from Vietnam in 70. The guy committed suicide in 78, I think, 78 or 79. Anyway, it hasn't moved since then.
So is that just a reminder for him, or why is it there? Is it just,
The reason that he bought the car was because of the guy. And the reason that he had the bottle of tequila was for the guy. He didn't drink. He was taking him a bottle of tequila.
so both the car and the tequila?
So part of his punishment is that he never drove that car again.
your brother?
My brother,
But he took him a bottle of tequila every time he went to go talk to
he
him.
did. He took
So
him a
he
bottle.
was enabling him.
He was enabling the other
It's the
guy.
enabler.
I guess you can say that. So now that the man is dead, has committed suicide, he doesn't drive the car, and that bottle of tequila is still in the back of his car. I know. Now here's the bizarre part. He buys a bottle of tequila on the anniversary of his suicide, of the guy's suicide. He doesn't drink it.
So what does he do with the tequila?
So that the trunk of that car
Where's
is
this car?
full of tequila. Exactly. I don't know. Does tequila spoil if you don't drink it within a certain amount of
Doesn't
time?
it age?
I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know how it works. Anyway, so that's my brother. And my parents wouldn't admit that he has PTSD. That's the strange part. Yeah, he keeps doing all these strange things like building the rifle pits all around our property. It's only 20 acres, and I think he's got 5. One time I went home, and we've got a creek that runs through our property, and it was eating the bank away. So I went and collected rocks to keep the bank from washing away. But I used some of the rocks from one of his rifle pits. Did he ever get pissed? Let me tell you, we almost got in a fist fight because I moved his rocks. The predictions have often been for long-term risk, which is harder to predict than violence risk over a shorter time frame. Now the reality was, and this is what happened with my consulting, We couldn't predict what was going to happen. We didn't know what environment they were going to move into. We didn't know how the environment would change over time. So you can't predict long-term risk. You just can't do it. Maybe they'll go home and his significant other has wandered off with the milkman or something. You just can't predict any of this stuff. And any of this stuff could become triggers. Paddock, the guy that shot up Las Vegas, what was his trigger? It seemed to have been activated 18 months before, because he started accumulating guns and ammunition for 18 months before he shot up Las Vegas. He went to Boston to another concert and was set up to shoot up that concert, but he didn't open fire for some reason. We're not exactly sure why. We don't know. So we never know. Long-term risk, you can never predict what's going to happen in the long term. A good example is marriage. My God, you every time you get married for forever, right? You get married forever, so you can't predict that she's gonna, or he, whichever the case may be, that they're going to run off with, I don't know, your best friend, or the milkman, or whatever. Or the mailman, you just never know. Or the mail lady, I guess. I mean, you never know what's going to happen next. So you can't predict any of this stuff, but they ask you to. So they were incarcerated 6 years ago. They were released from prison early because some consultant said that they were going to be okay, but you can never predict what's going to happen in the long term. And that's exactly what happened in Ohio. So every time somebody rapes somebody in Ohio, I always look at them and you never see this stuff. Thank God. I would never look at it anyway. That was back in 2003. Clinicians should, one, have information about the range of historical, personal, and environmental violence-related variables. There was a situation in Montana. There was an individual that had been a pedophile. And he was also a cannibal. And he got arrested and put in prison as a pedophile. While he was in prison, the psychologist visited the individual, and they said, he has this proclivity for cannibalism. I don't think we should release him from prison. But they didn't have a choice. And they released him on parole. And some kid came over to his house and disappeared. They couldn't find him. They couldn't find anything of him. But he was arrested for murder, even though they had no cadaver. They arrested him for murder, and they put him in prison for life. And he's still there. It's a very famous case in Montana. But theoretically, he ate the kid. And the psychologists had said that, if there's the right trigger, and with pedophiles, the trigger is kids running around or kids making noise. That's what the trigger is. So they keep telling you, don't let these people in places where there's a lot of kids, like trailer parks. Well, that's what happened with this guy. And he hired this kid. At one point, he hired the kid to mow his lawn. He was only like 9 years old, but he hired him to mow his lawn. The next thing they know, the kid disappeared. And they looked for him all over the place. They looked for him all over this guy's property. They looked at the state park down the road. They looked everywhere. They couldn't find him. And they assumed that he ate him. But you can only eat the soft parts. You can't eat the bones. I don't know. Anyway, they never found anything. But he's in jail forever. So clinicians should limit their predictions to specific kinds of violent behavior. This is the problem. Violence is violence, and sometimes it looks this way and sometimes it looks that way, but you need to only predict select things. Concentrate on appraising risks based on specific settings. don't put him in a trailer park. This is what happened. I live in the Quad Cities in Iowa. Rock Island is one of those Quad Cities. Rock Island has a problem with pedophiles. And they can only live in certain parts of the city. Well, these certain parts of the city are the richer parts of the city. They don't care if they move into, you know, a poorer section of the city. So there's a trailer park down by the Mississippi River. It's on the Mississippi River, Rock Island is. There's a trailer park down there, and they discovered that all the pedophiles were there at this one. And all the pedophiles that were living in Rock Island were all living in this one trailer park, and they'd started moving in there, 15 years ago, and they had all these kids that were claiming that they'd been molested. Oh my God! And then they realized that they have this whole cluster of individuals. I know, it's so stupid.
What do you think about the guy that committed that murder with two other, the mother and I think it was his cousin, the one that happened in Albuquerque? The guy
Oh.
that they're releasing, Fabian, what do you think? I mean, the guy dismembered a body, right?
Right.
A child. Why did the judge allow him to go free? That is crazy.
Yeah, it is. It doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. There was a problem in the case, though, wasn't there? Didn't they get evidence that they shouldn't have gotten? Or,
There's really no evidence against the guy, the Fabian, this guy Fabian, so the judge says that there's no
Well, if there's
evidence
no
against
evidence,
him, that
I
he
mean, how do
did
you
commit
prove
the murder, but he also tampered with the evidence, which is, get rid of the body.
oh, of course, one.
Dismembering a child, a body.
Sure.
Isn't that a crime in itself?
Well, sure, if you have evidence that he did it,
Well,
but if you don't have any evidence, you don't have a choice.
there is evidence that he participated in it, according to the judge. But he's claiming that he's innocent because the guy wasn't there when the child was murdered at the time.
So all they know is that this guy participated in the dismemberment of
Yes.
the child. Okay. But he didn't, there's no evidence that he murdered the
No.
child. Right.
That's just,
See, this is one of the problems with the law. The law says that you have to know that this person did it. You have to have the evidence that he did it. Knowing that he did it, that means nothing. You have to have the evidence to show that he did it. Otherwise, it's circumstantial. And look at all the problems we've had with circumstantial evidence. This is not fair, is it?
no.
We should be able to just arrest people. Well, that's not going to work.
I mean, the crime itself was, gruesome. I mean, just what they did to that poor child.
Sure.
Anybody who even participates in something like that should be kept behind bars. To me,
For what? What crime did he commit?
he committed, getting rid of dismembering the body. He was,
So
he
that's,
made the crime
that's,
happen.
so I mean, if you're accessory after the fact, that's what they call it, accessory after the fact. The Supreme Court has decided that the heinousness of the crime shouldn't change the decision that the judge or the jury made. That's not fair. So murder is murder, whether
So
you,
I guess the difference is a guy is, that you could compare that to that case that happened here on the amalgamation. A couple of guys participated in tampering with the evidence
right.
of the two people. But they're still behind bars. Is it because there's a difference in the state laws? New Mexico
Federal
and
laws.
Arizona?
No, it's federal and state. That's the problem. You've got federal law and you've got state law. State laws are usually a little bit more flexible than the federal laws because the federal laws are written by Congress, and of course they can't write laws for everything. so you're not gonna write all those criminal laws. The other thing is, there's no parole in federal cases, but there is in state cases.
So this New Mexico case is a state case?
Oh,
not a
yeah.
federal case.
Well, sure, unless it happened on the reservation. Did it happen on the reservation? Happened in Albuquerque. Yeah. That's the difference. Isn't that exciting?
I thought a case like that just automatically becomes a federal case. Anytime there's,
No. No. There has to be a reason why it would go to federal court. It would be a federal court if they transported the body across state
state
lines.
lines.
Yeah, then there would be no jurisdiction. You'd have to argue as to who has jurisdiction, Arizona or New Mexico, right? Then it becomes a federal case. As weird as that sounds. Okay, we need to stop right here.